Hi, everybody. Getting ready to start our second wonderful panel with our two professor guests, James Tompkin. James Tompkin became a professor in computer science at Brown after becoming a doctor of engineering and has published extensively in computer graphics. He's now interested in making computer graphics as a medium accessible to the public. And James will be speaking with Thomas Thwaites, currently a speculative designer interested in technology and science. His projects include attempting to build a toaster from scratch without an industrial manufacturing facility, and using prosthetics to take a holiday from being human and live with goats. He is currently working on shepherding 12 augmented reality domestic objects to exhibition at the Elms, a Gilded Age mansion in Newport this summer. Let's give a round of applause.
All right, so hello everybody. I am extremely pleased to be here, and I just want to thank all of the student volunteers for organizing this. So I work in the computer science department, and we're toolsmiths, I suppose you would call us. I work in an area called visual computing, and this is all kinds of combinations of things to do with media and graphics. So it combines computer vision, which is how we build machines that can see, that can perceive in the world. And then computer graphics, which is how we synthesize realistic imagery. And then how these two things interplay with humans in terms of human-computer interaction, which governs everything we do really with computers. But what does this really mean? Well, we build tools for people to manipulate media. So I'm just going to show you three little things that we do as a lab. Okay, so we let you like drag space around in photographs. Stuff like that. Or we do things like let you manipulate video. So here's our input. It's this person. They're sort of occluding the performance. Okay, so we can just get rid of them. Or how about this one? I don't really like this house. You might like it, but I don't. So I want to change some things about it. Okay, so here I've changed the walls to brick, and I changed the roof to slate. Oh, it's a bit dark. And I put this new driveway in here, like this. Hey, you want to see that again? So this is brick here. All right, and then this is stone here. Okay, and so this is hard because I have to remake the world to be able to then see this change. And we can use some tricks to get this to come out. The real problem here is the shading coming through the trees, this shadowing. And if I could somehow decompose this from what we'll call the object's color, then I can change this without affecting this shadowing and then put them back together again at the end. If I do this kind of edit naively, like in Photoshop, and I don't care about what this illumination decomposition does, then it looks like this thing on the right. No longer looks like reality. But if I can do this decomposition, if I can recover this illumination layer, I can produce something like this on the right. Okay, so when challenged with this prompt, through the kinds of tools we create to help people edit and manipulate media, like what are the spaces I think about? So I thought I would just add them up. Okay? So I think about light, and in computer graphics, we have this thing called a planoptic function, which represents all light everywhere. It's a monster. Every position in space we define, and then for every position we define a sphere, and we define a ray in space, a light ray, defined by two angles on this sphere. And then we count the amount of light that goes along this ray, the number of photons if you want, and we have this function that describes light going everywhere in this 5-dimensional space. 3 dimensions for x, y, z, and then 2 for this sphere. But things move as well, so you add another dimension to this of time, and this thing starts getting big. But this is the space of light that we think about. Now, when we capture this with a camera, everything gets compressed down or projected to an array of pixels. So here we have something to demonstrate our picture elements. And in our 500 by 500 array, each of these pixels in a regular camera takes some value from 1 to 256. And this is just how much light there is at each of these pixels. Right? But if you just count how many possible pictures there are in this representation, it's huge. Every possible combination comes out to be 10 to the 600,000 possible images within this representation. Right? Only some of these are what we would call natural images. Most of these are just noise, like interesting, curious patterns that we might describe as visual noise. But there is some subset within this space of pictures that look like real scenes. How big is that space? This is the kinds of questions that we think about. The other thing I like about this is that as a human being, you can recognize some version of any scene within a photograph with this representation. Every person that ever lived, if you take their facial photograph, it would live within this space. And this space takes up some tiny amount of memory in a computer. Yet it can encapsulate some version of everything that ever was. Okay, how are we doing? The next thing I talk about is the space of scenes. So what do I mean by this? When I have my image as a raster, we call it, it represents objects that we've imaged in the world. And those objects have geometry. They have a form, a shape. Those objects are illuminated by lights. And so we think about where those lights come, where the light comes from as our rays of light. And then each of these objects has some material properties that defines its visual appearance in this image. And if we enumerate all of these things, we end up with some 20-ish dimensional space of all of the different parameters that this takes up. Okay? So it's our job in visual computing to map between these spaces, these different representations. We have this real-world space of light with this planoptic function. And with a camera, we capture that, and it gets projected down into these 2 dimensions of our image. And then this is where the computer vision comes in. So computer vision is working out how a machine can see things from a camera image. Okay? And so to be able to make decisions about the world as a robot or as an autonomous car, something like that, I need to analyze this image to produce these scene models so that I know how far away something is in the world so that I'm not going to run into it, for instance. Now this seems kind of difficult. I've gone from this two-dimensional space where everything has been projected down, and I now need to infer some high-dimensional space of shape, of illumination, of material, of motion. So this is extremely difficult, but that's computer vision as a whole. Okay, and then we have the other side. When we talk about computer graphics, we talk about making images. And graphics is, or the way that I think about it, is building the visual world from first principles. And these first principles are represented by these scene models, these geometries, illuminations, material appearances, things like that. And so the synthesis step takes us back to this 2D image via computer graphics. Okay, and then through our displays, through projectors, through smartphone screens, we go back to this world of emitting light in our ray space up here. Okay, so that's how I think about space within my discipline. These three different spaces. Shall I continue? Or that's about where I end. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Great. And now we'll be transitioning to some slide material from Thomas Thwaites before a Q&A.
Thank you.
Hello. I'm also British, coming over from old England to New England. Which is, and you know, I only met James. We had our blind date yesterday, and we discovered that we had studied at the same university as undergrads, University College London. And so, you know, so I was kind of thinking, how am I going to approach this panel and the kind of themes of this conference and this sort of happenstance of, you know, having gone to the same university. So I thought, you know, I'm going to try and approach it autobiographically a bit and talk about me. And so, yeah, exactly, exactly, yeah. So I was kind of thinking about my own kind of educational sort of history, and I actually started out trying to be a computer scientist like James. I went to Edinburgh University, you know, kind of thinking, what am I going to do with my life? Okay, I'm going to go to Edinburgh University and become a computer scientist. So I did a year of computer science and artificial intelligence, and it was a real slog getting up, and it was dark, and then going to school, and it was, you know, then spending all day on a computer and then leaving, and it was dark. Yeah, well, you know, undergraduate first year computer science, it wasn't what I was expecting or something, you know, where's the glamour, where's the excitement? And so that's when and so I was like, okay, you know, I need to do something different. Maybe I'll be an artist. And so I went and did a art foundation year, you know, kind of a little bit of sculpture, a little bit of painting, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. And okay, what am I going to do after this foundation year? And I was like, okay, but I don't want to be an artist. Oh, God. And so that's when I went to UCL and ended up doing this degree called Human Sciences, which is sort of in the life sciences department, and it's kind of this degree for people who don't know what they want to do. But it was, you know, it was basically life sciences with bits kind of tacked on, and so I did a little bit of economics, and I found that kind of fascinating, and I did a bit of philosophy of science, and found that really fascinating, and kind of learned about the structure of scientific revolutions, and then was like, okay, well, am I going to, you know, what am I going to do after this degree? PhD in biochemistry or bioinformatics was on the cards, and I thought I'll just kind of check what that's going to be like. So I did an internship at a biochemistry lab and spent a summer doing this. This is my pipetting action. And I was like, where's the glamour? And so finished my undergraduate degree kind of slightly cast adrift, and trying to still basically work out how I can combine this kind of fascination with the ideas in the sciences with a bit of the kind of freedom and glamour of the arts. Sorry to, you know, that was my thinking at the time. Well, yeah, it has slightly. But yeah, and I kind of heard about this course at the Royal College of Art called Design Interactions, and this course, Design Interactions, had started kind of in the early 90s as computer-related design. And it was like, oh, how are these like weird computer things gonna maybe be used in the kind of, you know, creative design world? And so, you know, I guess they were doing stuff a bit like this and very early CAD. And then kind of through the 90s, you know, oh, it turns out computers are a thing. And, you know, designers need to kind of design the interactions that humans have with computers. So this course at the RCA changed from computer-related design to interaction design. And in the design world, interaction design is, you know, it's a whole field in itself, UX, UI, and human-computer interaction. And, you know, and it kind of continues. And so I guess the interaction design course, you know, mid-90s, they were sort of, you know, sending stuff to Ars Electronica, and, you know, you can see their hypertext, you know, won a prize at Ars Electronica in 1995. So the kind of early years, and then by the time I got to it, the name of this course had changed again from interaction design to design interactions. And the people that had kind of taken over this course, their reasoning was, okay, so this course has always been about kind of how a frontier of technology and science relates to the design profession. And obviously a frontier can kind of moves, you know, computers are everywhere now, so of course they have their own frontier, but they started, you know, thinking, okay, what's the kind of other frontiers in the sciences? And they kind of moved it into this area, this space of, you know, industrial design and how industrial design will relate to kind of new technologies, wherever those technologies may be. And so people on the course started doing work like this. This is an early piece of work by Toby Kerridge called Biojewelry, and this kind of frontier they were exploring was kind of tissue scaffolds. And so what Toby did was got stem cells from people when they were having a kind of tooth extraction, and used a tissue scaffolds to grow people's bone in the form of a ring, and he made these kind of wedding rings made out of each partner's own bone. And and so, you know, kind of an interesting project, definitely playing with that kind of disgust reaction. But, you know, this is like a frontier, you know, kind of, and so the idea is that we're thinking about how these kind of lab technologies may kind of end up being in the world. Will we have in the future a field of design which is, you know, design tissue engineering interaction or something like that, you know, kind of implants in the human body, and, you know, how will we kind of, as kind of a society, or, you know, societies, how will we kind of react to that? And so my own work, so this is a early piece of work, and I guess I'm trying to talk about the spaces now that I kind of try and like dip a toe into. And so I was asked just after I graduated to do some work with the UCL Security Science Doctoral Training Centre about the future of crime. And, you know, being a kind of designer, I kind of started running workshops, doing all that kind of stuff with the people in this training centre. And I ended up imagining, okay, so how will, you know, assuming that synthetic biology, genetic engineering, assuming that, you know, continues its trajectory, becoming kind of more familiar, easier to use, the protocols, you know, become standardized, people can use genetic engineering outside of the lab. You know, how will the old metropolitan police respond to this kind of new technology when it's in the world? And so I kind of speculated about a metropolitan police beekeeping unit, and their job would be to keep beehives, and the bees would kind of fly out and then get pollen all over them, fly back to these special police beehives, and then as the bees entered, they would have a kind of, you know, a sample of the pollen dusted off them, and then there would be a camera in the hives which would record the waggle dances the bees do when they return to the hives. And the idea was that through using bees, the police could kind of surveil the genetics of the plants growing in that kind of, you know, 5-mile radius from the hive. And so they would be able to see if anyone had taken the kind of active ingredient, the gene that codes for THC or whatever from the marijuana plant, and inserted it into a tomato plant. They would be able to see if anyone was growing any of Monsanto's patented, licensed seed without having a license. They would be able to, you know, see if any kind of terrorists had, you know, produced some kind of poison in a kind of innocuous daffodil or something. And so I made this video.
I'm Mark. I'm a Metropolitan Police Officer with the Genetic Surveillance Unit. I have been for 5 years. I was a regular officer, but I much prefer doing this.
So I'm trying to get... Yeah, so I'm going to kind of...
My job involves...
skip a
so
bit.
they can go through windows, into gardens quite freely.
Oh, anyway. So, yeah, so he kind of goes on, and it's kind of this imaginary world, this, like, high-tech collision with the mundane. And, you know, you start seeing signs like this. And I've learnt recently that what I was talking about was urban metagenomics. And so imagine, you know, kind of... genetically sequencing like the pollen from an entire kind of hive. It would just be like billions upon billions of base pairs, yet this new field of urban metagenomics, that's exactly what, you know, people are starting to do. And so, yeah, so that's kind of where I sit, and this is perhaps also something about spaces. So in the A column, we have kind of words that describe industrial design as traditionally taught. In the B column is where this kind of course that I was doing at the RCA is coming from. It's kind of a bit more, rather than designing stuff for production, we're designing stuff for debate. Or we're kind of asking questions, finding problems, that's the idea. And so on the one hand, we have design as a vocation, and we're going out kind of talking to our users and, doing focus groups, and then going to kind of back to the studio, designing a product, and then going to a factory, and then, sort of getting that product produced. I guess the design I do is this sort of something as a vehicle for critique or something like that. And so I'm more interested in going to the labs and, going and kind of getting into the back corridors of universities. And so briefly, I will just go through some of the spaces. So it was mentioned I tried to make an electric toaster from scratch. And so that involved going to talk to the Rio Tinto Chair of Advanced Mineral Extraction at the Royal School of Mines. It involved going down into mines with archaeologists and talking about early ways that we kind of smelted metal. It involved pestering large companies like BP to, try and kind of encroach on their business so I could get a jug of oil from like an oil rig at the source. It involved going to kind of factories and kind of talking about how this plastic is recycled and kind of pestering them. And this kind of reaction is kind of quite sort of what I'm looking for, basically. Slightly is like going and, yeah. And so, so that was the toaster, and then kind of putting it in the shops. And I guess, this is sort of what I think I'm doing a bit. So I, cross over all these fields that you scratch the surface, and material science, there's libraries devoted to material science, but it's like, but I'm, and so how do you kind of take a line through all of these fields? And I guess it's like, having a ridiculous goal, like making a toaster or becoming a goat. And so this, in a similar way, involved visiting shamans to, talk about human-animal transformations, visiting goat behavioural psychologists, visiting neuroscientists to, try and turn off the bits of my brain that make me different from a goat. And so I'm looking at visiting clinicians to make prosthetics to become a goat, and, kind of going to anatomy, biology. This is the Royal Veterinary College, and kind of, looking at a goat as it transforms, from something recognisable as a goat to kind of recognisable as meat, and gut biology labs, and then of course to goat farms, to and so all I've done is kind of gone into a field and hung out with some goats, but in a way I've also used it to kind of traverse many different fields. And where does this work end up? It ends up in galleries, in books, the spaces this ends up. But I think it's, it's also nice kind of when it ends up outside of the rarefied spaces of, galleries and so on. Okay, so I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Great, now we have time for a couple of questions. Remember, if you'd like to text a question in, the number is at the bottom of the second page of your program.
Just shout, please.
Yeah.
So I noticed that the connection that I see between both of your presentations is this idea of reimagining. Reimagining spaces for the world. Hello. Okay. yeah, one connection that I see is reimagining the world with like the moving of the architecture or the sort of like speculative bee police. And I see a lot of humor. And I'm wondering if that's something that you actively think about or how that comes into, this is for both of you, how humor comes into that work.
I can go first. Yes, in the scientific process, we have to convince other scientists that our work is valuable. And one of the ways I try and do that is make them laugh, because they're human beings too. So we try and make, somewhat charming demonstrations of what the tool can accomplish. So it's definitely a fact. But sometimes sorry about the bee connection, sometimes there's a sting in the tail, because some scientists, through the peer review process, don't really like it when you make jokes, which is somewhat depressing. Because, science has to be rigid and matter of fact, otherwise it loses its sincerity. But I don't think that's true at all.
Surely you can have big important title, colon, silly title.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That happens a lot.
Yeah. I think, definitely humour is a way of kind of engaging with the bigger questions, and I definitely try and sort of try anyway, and use it in my work. And in fact, this kind of goat thing, it was partly a reaction to the there's a whole field of bio art, which tends to be a little bit or in my view anyway, it tends to be a little bit sort of darkened spaces with a kind of single lit kind of Petri dish with some kind of disgusting, gloopy sort of thing going on. And I was like, I just sort of wanted to make do some work in that area which had a different kind of feel to it. And also, I like the mundane, I like, part of the thing is imagining these kind of technologies or, in our kind of mundane world, and there's something that you can there's something a bit funny about that, I think. This kind of collision of, the banal and the sort of, super high tech.
Great. Any other questions?
Hello? Oh, wow. I love sorry, this is really distracting. I love, Thomas, how you just dive into things and do a deep dive in terms of I love the toaster and the goat, the goat projects. And it's I think the innovation, the thing that I see in it is just being totally taking on this thing nobody else has. Or that's my perception as a computer scientist that doesn't know that much about art. But in that, have you found anything that you've any experiences or anything any big takeaways that you've kind of found from that process that might relate to the research process, or because it kind of in its own way is a form of a research process, just in a different way?
I think partly it's in the telling, isn't it? Because it's not necessarily that interesting writing emails, you know, that's quite a lot of what that kind of thing is, writing emails, can I come and visit, can I come and, you know, do this, oh, I need to, like, order, you know, and so it's kind of making research into a story, and, you know, using that story to then hopefully kind of bring in slightly sort of bigger thoughts. You can kind of enjoy it as a story, definitely, but, you know, I hope, you know, the GOAT thing was funded by the Wellcome Trust as part of their kind of public understanding of science program, and so and so it was, you know, partly about kind of making visible different ideas about what organisms are. So it was like, you know, the kind of the neuroscience, the sort of, I don't know, social psychology, the physiology, the anatomy, and then the kind of the cultural kind of soul or something. So I think it is kind of the story, and then you know, and then kind of making this, you know, research process into a story, and then also using the story to guide you. Like, I could have gone down this, you know, like sitting in the library, like writing this kind of project up, and you know, you can talk about anything. Like, you could do a whole, you know, about kind of transformations in kind of classical Greek myth or something. You know, there's a library about that, and so so I guess it's using the story to kind of guide this research process, and also kind of telling it as a story. I'm not sure if that answered your question exactly, but
yeah, I think one other thing that I found too is that, like, research is actually, like, in prepping papers, it's all about the stories that you're trying to tell in the research too, which is kind of interesting, because it's much more like, stories are, when you have an underlying story that's interesting, it allows you to be able to communicate it to other people in such a way that they're compelled, which I think is really, so thanks for sharing that.
I have a counter question for James, just as a designer. I was wondering, do you always make discoveries within the research process? And like, have you ever made discoveries by deviating from that process, or like a more scientific process?
I would say the process doesn't really start with science. So as we are, I don't know, we're sort of like a service in some sense as toolsmiths. We have to make the tool that somebody wants. But there's also this idea that nobody knows they want the tool until you've made it. So for the first of those, it means going out to people who want to make things but can't yet, or it's just too expensive, or it's too time-consuming. The things that I showed, nobody would endeavor to do them by hand without the computer vision, because they'd just be too expensive. It would take too many man-hours to rebuild that house in the stone, virtually. So part of it, the first part of that is to say it doesn't. Some of the discoveries come from going out and asking people what they need, and then some are just serendipitous. That you have the idea from whatever reason that you were preconditioned, as our previous panel said, to discover it from your knowledge. Yeah.
This is sort of a follow-up question to that for James. I'm wondering how you think about, so your slides talk a lot about the like the numbers of images, and I wonder how you think about sort of the social quality or emotional quality of changing images, or the one with the passing figure. Like, clearly there's an emotional element to, or like a result with these like technologies that are
right. And is this like a black hat, white hat question? maybe I should explain. In the security community, in the computer security community, any technique or method can be used for, for good or bad. And when I want to use it for good, I put on my white hat. And when I want to use it for bad, I put on my black hat. And so there are white hat hackers and black hat hackers, things like that. And so there could equally be white hat visual computing scientists and black hat too. Usually what happens is that you develop the technique, and the thing that makes it work can also be used to detect its use. So, for instance, in the part where we, in paint, we remove the people from the scene, the technique that can produce that can also detect when that has been done. And so we were talking about duals earlier, and there's some relation to that, and that the method can work both ways. Yeah.
I think that's partly what, I'm doing a bit in, this kind of critical design area is doing, design has always been like so kind of, happy and positive and, and oh yeah, we'll make these kind of, wonderful interfaces and but of course, for helping our users to, that's the kind of the conversation you have in sort of design, but then, now there is sort of the past kind of 20 years, there's been this like, oh, hold on a sec, all of these tools can be used as like a white hat or a black hat, and, we're kind of seeing, these questions arise with, are these devices humanely designed? They're designed to, Facebook is designed to addict, all, kind of quite sort of, consciously designed to, be addictive, and so I guess that's the area of design that I'm kind of in, is a little bit like, oh, hold on, designers, aren't we? What are we really doing, kind of thing. So, yeah.
Great. We have time for a couple more questions if anyone would like to get one in.
This is kind of a quirky question, but as a mother and as someone who's helped to raise children outside of my own home, I am interested in your minds and the fact that you constantly are creating. You constantly are asking questions. You constantly are delving into some area, then after another, and you are never going to let yourself stop. And I wonder how we could possibly get that into our educational system. I'm sorry to ask that question, but I just am sitting here pondering it.
So I've only been doing this since September. It's my first kind of teaching gig. And so I've kind of like been asking myself that question a bit as well. And, having kind of conversations about it. And is it like, is it too much kind of standardized testing? We get these kind of things at RISD where we're talking about like differences in generations and so on. Has there been too much kind of standardized testing growing up? I mean, I don't really know. I think my own personal experience, both my parents are from New Zealand, they have this kind of slight kind of rugged mentality, like I grew up in a building site basically, my dad was constantly doing DIY kind of, so, I don't really know, I mean, but I guess, RISD is a good place to start, I think, from my point of view. James, I don't know.
Maybe I'll take a slightly different approach to answering this question. As a computer scientist, we sort of have this maxim that we never want to do anything that the computer can do for us. It's like extreme laziness. We would spend, 100 hours writing a piece of software to perform a task for us that we could manually do in an hour so that no one ever has to do that hour again. Right? So a lot of our creativity comes from this strange selfishness that we want the machine to do everything, and we want to imagine ourselves lying on a Caribbean island beach somewhere with everything happening for us automatically. That might seem slightly glib, but that is one way that it drives creativity. There was one more question at the back. Oh.
I thought it was really interesting how James was describing space as a number of possibilities in a memories computer, which I thought related to Kanelecki's thoughts about space and possibility and in like removal over time. And I was wondering if either of you had any thoughts about how new technologies are shaping our perceptions of space.
Yeah.
Let's see, the web allows us to stop remembering information and just remember where we found that information. And coming up in the next few years, there's going to be a whole set of technologies that embed computing in physical spaces in ways that we haven't had before. Some of these relate to augmented reality that Thomas was talking about very briefly at the beginning, or the general idea of pervasive or ubiquitous computing. And so I wonder whether we will have the same kind of effect for physical spaces that we have for information spaces now.
Yeah, I suppose why I was interested in augmented reality, doing a little course on augmented reality, is because, it's a very clear way in which, physical objects that we like to design over in that industrial design building are kind of then, collided with, everything which is virtual. And so, the frame I put around it was kind of gilding, it's called Design in the Second Gilded Age. And it's kind of, this critique of inequality, but then it's also thinking of, augmented reality, putting a virtual guild on just about anything and what you could kind of do with that. But the thing in my own work that I like about, or that I find interesting, is it happens so gradually that you'll never kind of realise. And I remember being quite upset when I realised that I was never actually going to live in the future, because I kind of imagine, I remember playing like a computer game when I was little, and it had like moving billboards, video billboards, and I can kind of remember thinking like, yeah, I'll know I'm in the future when there's video billboards. And then, years later, and I kind of realised that I'm surrounded by video billboards, and they're all kind of advertising. They're not advertising trips to Mars or anything like that. It's like shampoo or car insurance or something, and it's like, okay, this is, I didn't even notice. And so, and that's what I try and kind of play with a bit in my work a bit, yeah.
Great. We do have to get to some announcements for Michael, but if everyone could thank our panelists.